in the vicious treatment of defenseless citizens in Selma, where old women and young children were gassed and clubbed at random. We have witnessed an eruption of the disease of racism which seeks to destroy all of America. No American is without responsibility. All are involved in the sorrow that rises from Selma to contaminate every crevice of our national life. The people of Selma will struggle on for the soul of the nation, but it is fitting that all America help to bear the burden. I call, therefore, on the clergy of all faiths representative of every part of the country to join me for a minister's march to Montgomery on Tuesday morning, March 9th. In this way, all America will testify to the fact that the struggle in Selma is for the survival of democracy everywhere in our land.
March the 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. As you saw in those images, 600 mostly African-American protesters marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge are viciously attacked by local police, state troopers, and bystanders. Dozens are injured, some seriously. Images of the violence flash across television screens throughout the nation, leading to an outpouring of moral outrage and commitment never before seen in the history of our nation. The next day, Dr. King issues his call to Selma, urging clergy and really people of all faiths, all races, all walks of life to come to Selma. Thousands answer that call. And among those coming to Selma in the aftermath of Bloody Sunday are hundreds of Unitarian Universalists. They are ministers, seminary students, and lay people. They are men and women, young and old, black and white, committed social activists, and people participating in their very first protest. It is estimated that by the end of the protests, some 2 weeks later, 250 Unitarian Universalist clergy and over 500 lay people had journeyed to Selma. That's remarkable. We're a small denomination. And as you may know, and as you'll hear about in a moment, two of those Unitarian Universalists, the Reverend James Reed and Viola Liuzzo, tragically lost their lives. The story of Unitarian Universalism's role in Selma is the subject of a wonderful new book that I can't highly recommend enough. There's the image of it, The Selma Awakening by Mark Morrison-Reed. For those of you who may not be familiar with him, Mark Morrison-Reed is a Unitarian Universalist minister and scholar. He's now retired from parish ministry, and Mark is, without question, the foremost historian of Unitarian Universalism's relationship with and response to race and racism. This book's going to be for sale today. I think I see Judy Copen way over there with her hand up. Judy runs the book table. She's got a fair number of copies, and she'll also have copies of another important book about our role in Selma by the Reverend Richard Leonard, who was in Selma, and this is his first-hand account of his experience. I recommend both of these books very highly. Today, I want to tell you about Unitarian Universalism's experience in Selma through the lens of Mark Morrison-Reed's extraordinary book. And what makes this book so important is not just the compelling story it tells about what happened in Selma, but also the way it weaves that story into the broader narrative of Unitarian Universalism's experience and struggles with race and racism. So today's sermon is really going to be about Unitarian Universalism and Selma, and Unitarian Universalism and race. You won't hear a whole lot about Dr. King today. I've said a lot about Dr. King in previous sermons, and believe me, you will hear more about him in the future. But today we're going to focus our light, our lens, on this faith in that important moment in history. And as the book makes clear, Selma was truly a turning point, and Mark Morrison-Reed even calls it a tipping point in the history of our faith. Prior to Selma, Unitarians, Universalists, and then, as of 1961, Unitarian Universalists, when the two faiths came together, had proclaimed their commitment to civil rights and racial justice. We had espoused values of universal love and, at the time, brotherhood, and the dignity and worth of all people, probably man at the time. And those proclamations and values led to some significant actions in our history, like the leadership and involvement of people like Theodore Parker in the abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War. But it was in Selma that, for the first time in our history, Unitarian Universalists not only joined a racial justice movement in significant numbers, but also risked their lives for that movement. Rather than remaining behind the safety of stained glass windows, hundreds of UUs left their homes and churches, journeyed to a dangerous and unfamiliar place, and risked their lives for something greater than themselves. And as I said before, 2 of those lives were tragically lost. Why did they go? Why did so many Unitarian Universalists drop everything and journey to Selma? Part of the answer, I think, can be found in the words and explanations of those 2 martyred heroes I mentioned before. When asked by his wife, who didn't want him to go, why he was going to Selma, James Reeb simply told her, "It's a fight I believe in." Viola Liuzzo, who had become a Unitarian Universalist only a year before going to Selma, told her husband that she had to go to Selma because it's everybody's fight. There are too many people just standing around and talking. I want to take a moment to share with you the story of Reeb and Liuzzo. But before I get to that, I want to mention Jimmy Lee Jackson. I think you saw his photo there just a second ago. Jimmy Lee Jackson was an African-American protester, an Army veteran who was shot and killed 3 weeks before Bloody Sunday while trying to shield his mother and grandfather from a club-wielding Alabama state trooper. Jackson's death went largely unnoticed by the national media and still to this day is too frequently left out of or minimized in histories of the civil rights movement, although he's very vividly portrayed in the new movie Selma. Have any of you seen Selma yet? A couple of you. I went to see it on Friday. It's quite good. I highly recommend it. I am very pleased to share the news that Unitarian Universalism has been trying to right this wrong, and one small way that we have done that is to erect this plaque in our headquarters. That's Jimmy Lee Jackson on the left, James Reeb in the middle, and Viola Liuzzo on the right. Reverend James Reeb's journey to Selma, and this is his photograph here. Reverend James Reeb's journey to Selma turned out to be the final chapter in a life devoted to justice and service to others. Reeb had recently left his position as an associate minister at the All Souls Unitarian Universalist congregation in Washington, D.C., to work as a community minister and activist in a poor, largely African-American neighborhood in Boston. Similarly, Viola Liuzzo had been active in social justice work and causes in her native Detroit long before becoming a UU and going to Selma. For those not familiar with the tragic details of this story, Reeb and 2 other Unitarian Universalist ministers were attacked 2 days after Bloody Sunday as they left a restaurant in Selma. Reeb suffered what turned out to be a fatal head injury and died 2 days later. Dr. King led Reeb's memorial service in Selma. James Reeb's murder made national headlines and was a key turning point in President Lyndon Johnson's decision to push for immediate passage of voting rights legislation. And just a few months later, in the summer of 1965, Johnson signed the historic Voting Rights Act. Viola Liuzzo's murder received much less attention from the national media. She was killed a couple of weeks after Reeb while driving several protesters back to Selma after the historic march from Selma to Montgomery had finally been completed, and her memorial service took place several days later in Detroit. Now, we Unitarian Universalists often assume that our involvement in Selma was somehow automatic or inevitable, given our core values and longstanding commitment to social justice. But as Mark Morrison-Reed points out, in the years prior to Selma, that commitment and those values did not always translate into meaningful action. In fact, when it came to the struggle for racial justice, right up until the moment that Reeb and Liuzzo and so many other UUs went to Selma, there was a disparity, a disconnect between Unitarian Universalism's espoused values, as Mark Morrison-Reed puts it, and our values in practice. Here's what he has to say about that. Far from standing at the forefront of racial justice and inclusiveness, at the time of Selma, Unitarian Universalism was a religion of white privilege with an almost exclusively Euro-American worldview. To cite just a few of the many examples Morrison-Reed points to, our worship and music was devoid of really any materials that reflected the African-American experience. Our religious education curricula rarely, if ever, touched on African-American stories or achievements. And many congregations in this period after the Second World War, including, I might add, this one, had moved or were moving from urban locations to suburban communities that were largely white and privileged. When it came to racial justice, Unitarian Universalism was a faith that too often said the right things without matching those words with deeds. But in spite of all those things that kept Unitarian Universalism largely white and privileged, other forces were emerging that made our journey to Selma possible, and yes, I would say, inevitable. As the book argues, and as the words of Reeb and Liuzzo, you heard earlier, make clear, Unitarian Universalists were stirred to action by the human rights and civil rights revolutions taking place right in front of them. The values at the heart of those revolutions, freedom and equality, human dignity and beloved community, were and still are the values at the heart of our faith. Unitarian Universalists simply could not sit back when everything they stood for was so clearly and dramatically at stake. In those images from the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, Unitarian Universalism was confronted so clearly with a challenge to the very values and principles we hold dear. So many who journeyed to Selma felt that they could not call themselves a Unitarian Universalist and accept what was happening in Selma. As Liuzzo said so well, this is everybody's fight. So they came. They came by bus and by car, by plane and by train, and they protested and they marched by the hundreds. From Bloody Sunday to the culmination of the campaign, a couple of weeks later, Unitarian Universalists stood up and spoke out. For the first time in most of their lives, they became part of a movement which was led by people of color and part of a movement which was truly working and sacrificing on behalf of their most cherished values. Over the course of their time in Selma, Unitarian Universalists listened, learned, sacrificed, and gave their lives. In a few minutes, I'll explore with you the impact Selma had on those Unitarian Universalists who went, and the meaning Selma has today as we strive to live those same values in a world in which, yes, so much has changed, but which indeed so much has stayed the same.
From the Selma Awakening. Integration triumphed in Selma in a way that transcended the word's customary and spurious meaning. Genuine integration happens when parts form a new whole. It is a melding rather than a subjugation of one by another. Some Unitarian Universalists achieved that melding during March 1965, when their values and practices meshed. when black and white stood together at the Selma wall, sharing in struggle and song, discomfort and celebration, needing one another. For this group of Unitarian Universalists, Selma was memorable because they experienced what it felt like to be whole, rather than experiencing the different aspects of the self at odds with one another. The barriers of race and class, head and heart were breached. Selma was about being an authentic relationship to one's values, promises, and hopes, and honoring them by committing one's life even unto death. It was about being an authentic relationship to African Americans and to one's own intelligence, emotions, spirit, and body. They knew they had bodies because those bodies not only ached but were threatened. They relied on their intelligence in order to act and survive. They could not escape their emotions. And they experienced the Spirit because in the midst of singing, it could not be denied. In giving themselves over to that time and its demands, to their conscience and a sense of honor, to their faith and what it stood for, to the future and what they had all hoped for, they found redemption. Together in Selma, they found that their lives had purpose, and many, perhaps for the first time, felt whole. This was the spirit of Selma. In the midst of turmoil, their values and their lives became congruent.
As you heard in that beautiful reading, Selma had an extraordinary impact on Unitarian Universalism. Those who went were forever changed. As you heard, for the first time, many experienced the reality that what they believed in and how they acted in the world were one and in harmony. I can't begin to do justice to all the beautiful first-hand accounts and memories that are shared in Mark Morrison-Reed's book. This is another reason you need to read it. I know it sounds like I'm on the book department at the UUA. I promise I'm not. But what these experiences and what these accounts share is the simple fact that many Unitarian Universalists went to Selma to change the world, and they came back from Selma changed and transformed themselves. That's the bottom line. That's what happened to Unitarian Universalism in Selma. And this experience, this learning, this transformation that so many felt while in Selma has had tremendous implications and impact on our faith. For one thing, I think it's fair to say that Selma forever changed the way we understand the meaning and purpose of social justice. In Selma, Unitarian Universalism learned that social justice is as much, if not more, about listening as it is about talking. And oh, how we like to talk. We learned that social justice is as much about following as it is leading, as much about feeling and emotion as it is about reason and rationality, as much about showing up and taking risks as it is about passing resolutions and signing petitions, and as much about being in relationship and standing in solidarity with those we are seeking to help, rather than standing above them or telling them what to do. Those were the lessons. That was the spirit of Selma. And I think this spirit of listening and learning, of showing up and taking risks, of building relationships and standing in solidarity, this is the model in Unitarian Universalism of social activism that we strive, that we aspire to follow. We still pass those resolutions and sign those petitions, and they're important. But over the years, I think we've come to understand that working for social justice must begin from a place of humility, from recognition that we don't have all the answers, and from a place, most importantly, of trust and relationship. And I can tell you that this model, this approach, is certainly what we aspire to here in our work in this congregation. And there was something else important that I think came out of Selma. Prior to that historic moment, most Unitarian Universalists, I think it's fair to say, saw themselves as being part of a faith that stood boldly for freedom and justice, and stood boldly for diversity and inclusion in the world, and especially in our congregations. Unitarian Universalism was for everyone, and the doors of our congregations were open to all. The fact that so many UUs were white and privileged was often attributed to everything under the sun, except the fact that we were, in reality, not as welcoming or inclusive as we thought. But after Selma, I think this perspective began to change. Having experienced what it's like to be in relationships of trust and love with people of color, those UUs who returned from Selma began to question just how welcoming and just how inclusive we really were. As Mark Morrison-Reed says so well, rather than being truly open to difference and diversity as we thought we were, Unitarian Universalism was actually, and this is not an easy thing to hear, was actually about assimilation. The assimilation of different backgrounds and experiences into the largely white Euro-American assumptions that dominated our faith and our congregations. While on the surface we welcomed them into our communities, the expectation was always that they would be or become like us. And it was this unspoken culture of assimilation that explains, in Mark Morrison-Reed's view, the glaring lack of African American faces and voices in Unitarian Universalism. Well, I wish I could stand here today and tell you that since Selma, significant progress has been made in making Unitarian Universalism more welcoming and more inclusive to people of color. But that's simply not the case. Of course, some of the most blatant mistakes we were making at the time have been corrected. Our current hymnals, unlike the ones that were around in the 1960s, contain words and music from African American voices, voices which were completely absent from our worship life 50 years ago. But as those of you who attend this or most any other Unitarian Universalist congregation know, our denomination remains mostly white and privileged. The reasons are undoubtedly varied and rooted in the assumptions and biases we are making about ourselves and those who are not coming through our doors. But here's what I think Selma helped us do. Selma enabled us to acknowledge, which is always the first step, right? It enabled us to acknowledge that maybe we're not as welcoming and as inclusive as we think. And this acknowledgement has led Unitarian Universalists over time to begin examining their assumptions about how welcoming and how open our doors truly are. I'm happy to report that this work is going on right now here at the UU Church of Akron, and this will be the topic of next Sunday's service called The Journey to Inclusivity, and I hope you will join us then. There's so much more I could say as I wrap up about Selma and its legacy for Unitarian Universalism, its legacy for our nation, and about this wonderful book that I hope you'll read by Mark Morrison-Reed. Let me just leave you with this passage from the book that comes near the end. I think it's inspiring and powerful. He writes, "It is not possible nor necessary to know the outcome of our actions. Therefore, we act in faith. Faith asks not that we succeed, but that we try. We try because we yearn to live out our values. Conscience urges us on, for we have dreamed of a better, more just tomorrow. We care, therefore we act. In acting, we risk having our hearts broken 1,000 times. Therefore, we are sustained by hope. That is the price those who cleared the way for us accepted. It is what living fully, deeply, and with integrity demands of all of us. The spirit of Selma, the legacy of Selma for all of us this day and every day. Blessed be, and thank you for listening.